The point in all of this is that a human is limited by our ability to absorb and interpret data, whereas a computer doesn't seem to be limited at that. I think the computer is currently limited to the whole emergence thing, the imagination, the creativity. And if a computer can overcome that boundary.
There's a lot of optimism about using AI for drug development. And there's also a second kind of layer on top of that. Once you get optimistic about that, which is an assumption, wait a minute, if AI gets powerful enough, it can start making its own drugs, pandemics, whatever. I'm very skeptical of this. But I don't work in drug discovery, so I think it's an interesting question for you is, first of all, when you're developing drugs, what would it take for AI to actually be useful for that? And the second thing is, let's say you want to take humans out of the equation. Let's say we want to make an AI Artem, right? So you set up this lab that we're interviewing in that's next door to this conference room. What does it take to set up the lab? Let's say I'm an AI, I want to build a lab and make a drug, let's say for good or evil. What does that actually take? And what would AI have to reach, or like what kind of data would it have to have access to actually develop a drug?
It's a very complicated question on multiple levels. So let's try to dissect a little bit. Let's start with information. Previously in today's conversation, we've touched on the topic of incomplete understanding or very poor understanding of life as it is. And we do have that problem. So we can only teach the AI what we know ourselves. So by definition, AI would have to have access to the totality of human knowledge pertaining to physics, math, biology, chemistry, and so on, right? Let's assume that that can be accomplished, which so far it hasn't been as far as I know. So far, AI has been trained on internet, which means cat cartoons and like best recipes for rhubarb pie, and it's great. I hope it stays that way because I am dubious about AI as a phenomenon, meaning we can be digging our own graves here a little bit, but we'll see. Anyway, so you give AI access to all of that, and then you have to give AI effectors, right? So you have to make AI able to physically perform the types of operations that are performed in a normal drug discovery, molecular biology, biochemistry, chemistry lab. So you have to equip it with effectors capable of synthesizing new chemical entities, testing them on model systems, and then repeating that in a sensible manner while augmenting its own capabilities as it goes. I think it is entirely possible, but it is very difficult. So right now, the effectors that we use are all targeted towards humans. So just to give you some small example, in order to move a few microliters of liquid from one place to another, we use a pipetter, which is a handheld device with a disposable plastic tip that comes on. You suck a little bit of liquid into it, you dispense it into a new place, and you throw the tip away. That's kind of become the standard. Is it the best thing for AI to do? I suspect not. I suspect that if you don't have hands or arms to begin with, and if your eyes are not at the level of roughly 1.5 to 2 meters from the floor, and if you're not limited to any of this, then why the hell would you need a pipetter?
Maybe lab on a chip?
Sure, lab on a chip, whatever. My point is that it's just the basic operations of transmitting a portion of fluid from one location to another, viewed from a perspective of an entity that is not restricted to human anatomy, is a task that ends up in places where we probably don't know. So I cannot tell you that I know how it will look like. I can tell you it will not be a pipetter. But to get to that point, the AI has to first go through iterations of doing it first like people do, right? So we can only teach it what we can do. And so what I am very curious is AI fundamentally going to be able to develop that type of a progress? So is emergence a real thing in AI? I think it's a hotly contested subject right now. The concept of emergence in AI is not at all clear, but it would have to be, because given a pipetter, generally speaking, a machine would do a crappier job because it's not a human. It makes no sense for a machine to develop an arm with which to hold a pipetter, push a button. That just doesn't sound right. I would be very interested in seeing what would ensue, but I guarantee you it will not look like something that a person can use.
So even if you step back from the mechanical part of it, you have to think of what to do, right? I don't know how long people have been pitching AI drug discovery, at least 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And before that, maybe it was called computational drug discovery, right? But it's really in some ways the same thing. There are no AI discovered drugs.
Not that I know of.
Or maybe even, not even, I don't know if there are even like good candidates. Maybe
there are companies that proclaim to a greater or lesser degree, including our own, that AI is helpful. So we think AI is helpful, but you cannot dispense of humans.
But it's helpful in the sense of coming up with some suggestions for molecules, or like where is there any traction at all?
I think we've seen traction on molecular design. So yes, suggestions of new molecules based on previous molecules. I think there's a good deal of traction in design of clinical trials and interpretation of clinical data, and the ability of machines to really not get bored with a deluge of small details. So I think that we've seen a lot of interesting things happening where machines are looking at complex, multidimensional biological data. So a combination of biomarkers and biophysics and biochemistry, you can produce an absolute deluge of data from a few cells, if you want. A single cell sequencing, single cell proteomics, you name it. And the point in all of this is that a human, which is what we touched on before, is limited by our ability to absorb and interpret data and hold it in working memory at one point, whereas a computer doesn't seem to be limited at that. I think the computer is currently limited to the whole emergence thing, the imagination, the creativity. And if a computer can overcome that boundary, I think we will see sort of true AI developments. Because as you said, abstracting from mechanics, you can say, okay, AI is going to work like this. It's just going to have a dedicated team of people doing all the same thing that people do, but completely brainlessly, right? Like, go make this molecule, human slave, and they'll just go make this molecule, and then go test it on a rat and tell me, did it squeak? Did it twitch? What happened? That obfuscates the need for emergence from that perspective, but the need for emergence remains.